So I was at a recent daylong with Bhikkhu Bodhi, a long conversation among lots of people about Buddhism and climate change, and I thought I would try to pack that down into a short little presentation and give that to you today. Coming up. So I'm Doug Smith, I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association, that's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in helping to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing to the channel. So recently, the great scholar and translator Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's translated most of the Pali Canon into English, probably the leading translator of early material today, gave a recent talk on climate change in Buddhism. He's also known for really founding Buddhist Global Relief, which is an ethical organization that's trying to relieve suffering, poverty, malnutrition, and women's issues in countries around the world. And this is a day-long presentation, so of course there's no way to get across all of it in a very short period of time, but I think it's important enough that it's at least worth at least hitting some of the highlights. So to begin with, he gave an overview of global warming, which I think is probably something familiar to many of us, but just to run through it quickly, I'll pick out three sort of major issues with global warming. The first, of course, is heat. We're going to see higher levels of heat around the world, which leads to illness and death, particularly because many of the places around the world that are going to be hit hardest are places without wide availability of things like air conditioning, without wide availability of electricity and so on. And so people in those areas, such as India, Southeast Asia, South Asia, are going to have a very hard time dealing just with the increased heat levels. Indeed, if memory serves, in 2003, which is the last really major heat wave across Europe, tens of thousands of people died. It's hard to believe that, but if you actually look it up, tens of thousands of people died from heat-related illnesses throughout Europe. And this is a first world part of the world where air conditioning is at least relatively widely available. Of course, the elderly, people who are infirm are hardest hit by heat waves like these. Secondly, of course, severe weather. We're seeing larger and more powerful storms. Of course, any individual storm we can't necessarily trace to issues of global warming because storms are random occurrences. But on average, if we're seeing more and more powerful storms, that is indeed, in the longer term, correlatable with higher levels of heat in the atmosphere. Also, we see desertification occurring around the world, and it's going to occur more as certain parts of the world become wetter, other parts of the world become drier, less able to support crops, support food for humans, which is going to make hunger all of more a problem as we go forward. And finally, higher sea levels, which will impact coastal communities particularly hard. And we can think, of course, in the United States of places like Florida, as well as all of our coastlines, which are going to be hit hard. But we can also think of poorer countries such as Bangladesh, other countries like that, Southeast Asia, the island nations, which are oftentimes too poor to deal with this in any kind of a reasoned way. And so what we're going to end up with is large amounts of forced migration, which leads to, of course, death, leads to stress, it leads to conflict. We've seen the amount of conflict that's occurred even in recent years just from Syria, the Syrian conflict in the Middle East, pouring over people into Europe. And how it's basically forced a lot of governments to the right, as forced migration occurs just from one country. If we see that multiplied and multiplied around the world, we can only imagine the kinds of problems that this could potentially cause. So having outlined the part of the problem, and of course I've only touched on a little bit of it here, Bhikkhu Bodhi wanted to go into some of the causes for this problem, of course, because the causes are really the issue, the pointed issue, because if you can counteract these causes somehow, you might have a chance of thwarting the effects. Here, Bhikkhu Bodhi tries to basically give a template of what he calls the different domains of human value, and the way that we value things, the way we should value things. So, for example, the fundamental human value has to be the biosphere, the ecological sphere that surrounds us, the Earth. Because without this value, without this ecological sphere, without the biosphere, none of us can survive. Secondly, there's the social sphere, the sphere of interactions in a social way between individual humans, cooperation on a local scale, or even on a modest scale or even on a global scale, but the way that humans can cooperate with one another, work together in some ways, this is, of course, its own store of value. Third is the symbolic or cultural values that we share. The arts, the sciences, the aspects of human concepts, of human communication that makes life worth living for so much of the time. And it does this by producing a world that surrounds us of artistic merit and also of scientific interest, because we use these concepts to categorize the world and to discuss those categories and to create our own categories and our own artistic communication, our own artistic displays and communication that make life worth living for so many. And finally, there's the ultimate sphere, which we might consider either in a religious or in a philosophical sense. In a religious sense, of course, these are the ultimate religious values that are, I would say, common to the religions, but of course they're not common. Each religion has its own idea of what the ultimate value is. But we also see in a general philosophical sense, let's say in an Aristotelian sense, eudaimonia, or human flourishing. And many of the world's philosophies, starting with the ancient philosophies of Greece and the ancient philosophies of India and China, had this idea of sort of ultimate value, ultimate human value, the thing that we were really on this world to do in some sense, or at least what made life worth living in the broader sense. And what Bhikkhu Bodhi did then is to come up with a kind of a diagram, which he calls the actualization of value, where we see that fundamental value, in a sense, is the bedrock. It's the foundation of all of the other values, because, of course, without it, we're nowhere. We can't survive. Then, on top of that are the social values, the values that bring humans together in community and in common kinds of efforts. The third being the aesthetic and intellectual values, scientific values, that lie on top of the social values, that they're sort of creations out of them, if you like. And finally, the capstone, which is these spiritual or ultimate values, eudaimonia, human flourishing, the reason we're on earth at all, or at least what makes life worth living in the kind of ultimate sense. And as may not surprise us, Bhikkhu Bodhi feels that part of the issue with global warming and global climate change and these kinds of general ecological disasters are a part and parcel. There's something that comes out of, they're the effect of an inversion of values. So, for example, what he says is that basically what happens is that monetary value, I would say also power, control, tends to usurp the top position. It takes over the issue of ultimate value. Money and power become the ultimate values. As a result, both nature itself and human interaction and cooperation become, as it were, commodified. They become items of exploitation. Become items of exploitation for monetary and power values. And the externalities involved in those, in other words, let's say the pollution involved, or the effect upon the world, the effect upon the bad effects upon the world, the bad effects upon human societies are externalized. That is to say, they're not part of the equation when we consider the profits and losses that are involved in these kinds of activities. Finally, aesthetic values then become thoroughly anti-intellectualized. They become forms of simple entertainment, mass value, without any real intellectual core or importance to them. Now, I think this could be overstated, because I think much of the arts are really pushing against this, but certainly we do see, at least in certain kinds of news organizations that push news as entertainment, we do see the kind of dumbing down of the news, a kind of faking of the news in order to entertain a certain group of population. And finally, what Bhikkhu Bodhi feels is that the ultimate value, these spiritual or eudaimonic values, these values of human flourishing, become unified with the idea of money, profit, and wealth. And what he calls this spiritual materialism, which he says he means to distinguish from Chögyam Trungpa's idea, which we discussed in a prior video. It's not so much Chögyam Trungpa's idea of spiritual materialism, but rather that actual money becomes spiritually superior. In other words, that it becomes that we're in the spiritual game. The point of life is simply to make money, to die with the most toys, as they say. And this kind of sacralization of wealth, this kind of sacralization of power, then usurps this whole scheme, such that the fundamental values become commodified, become exploited. So finally, what is the answer? And I think this is an open question for most of us. Bhikkhu Bodhi looked to one very interesting possibility, which is a work by a woman named Kate Raworth, who has an economics background as well as a background running relief organizations, or helping to run relief organizations. I believe she works at Oxford University now. And she came up with something called Doughnut economics. And Doughnut economics is, to an extent, a relatively complex topic, which, again, I can't cover in its fullness here. There are some talks she's given about it. I will try to leave at least one of them up here in a card, and I'll put them down below also in links. YouTube talks that have been taped. Kate Raworth's idea is to structure economics around human well-being rather than, let's say, efficiency or profit maximization. So the idea is to look towards an economic study that helps to enable greater possibility for human flourishing. And to achieve that, basically she diagrams human economic activity as sort of in a circle. And at the inner part of the circle are the people who are, let's say, the most poor, who are most who produce the least, who are at the most vulnerable in society. And on the outside we have the people who are doing the best, or the activities that are doing the most. That is to say, the highest productivity, the highest profit, the highest maximization of all these kinds of economic activities. And basically then, in this kind of circle of economic activity, she identifies what we might call a donut. It's kind of a ring inside of this. And the ring is defined by the two edges, the inner edge being the social foundation. So this is the inner ring, anyone inside of it being below that social foundation, so the people who do not have enough income to have a truly rewarding life. They may lack income for food, for water, for good jobs, for health care, for true justice within their societies, and for education, ongoing education. So you need a basic level, a base level of economic activity in order to have the goods that we all know and love in our own society. However, the outside of this donut, as she calls it, or this ring, is the environmental ceiling. In other words, there's a level above which we have overshot the ability of our environment to actually cope with the economic production that we are engaged in. So then the point of economics, as far as she sees it, is to find that happy medium, to find a way of structuring economic activity such that we are in that kind of green zone of that donut. Or in other words, as she says, instead of thinking of progress as a sort of a curve that goes forever upwards to the right, we should instead think of progress as balance, as being balanced between not being so destitute of economic activity that we are not able to achieve educational and social and medical goals for ourselves, but also are not so high as to impact negatively on the planet going forward, so as to make this all unsustainable. So Bhikkhu Bodhi suggests that Kate Raworth has some good ideas here, and I absolutely agree. I think that they're very, very interesting, and I would recommend everyone watching this to take a look and see what they think. But one of the questions I think that remains is what this has to do with Buddhism in particular. And I have a prior video about Buddhist economics in particular by a couple of people with an economics background who in fact really do push for a specifically overtly Buddhist economic undertaking. So for example, Vadaka Lin in his book The Buddha on Wall Street, and Claire Brown's book Buddhist Economics, a book of the same title as the topic, both of them are attempting to push something very much like this view of donut economics that we've just seen. Now, of course, they don't describe it in quite that way, but basically they're after the same end. That is to say, to change the direction, to change the aim of economics from one of simple profit maximization and efficiency maximization towards some broader and more ethically infused awareness of what true human flourishing might be and how to achieve it in a way that's sustainable. But we might also go a little farther and ask sort of what Buddhist principles might help in our own daily practice with this question. And this is one of the issues that we in fact discussed during that daylong. We had some breakout sessions and tried to discuss some of this. And so some of these ideas came from that breakout session, but basically I think that they might fall into two general areas. Firstly, we have the issue of what I would call generosity and renunciation, all around the idea of contentment. Okay, so when we think of the three fires or the three poisons, one of them is greed. And greed in this context is of course extremely important in forwarding, in giving an impetus to economic activity. Because it's because of economic activity, at least in Adam Smith's sense, it's because of this greed that we undertake economic activity. We're looking for something, we want something, we're missing something and somebody else has it, so we're willing to make an exchange of some kind. Or we're willing to work in order to get something that we don't have. And there's a sense of that that's perfectly fine, but there's also a sense in which it can be a problem, or it can become a problem. So the general notion of generosity is to try to combat this innate greed that we have by being more willing to give stuff away that we don't need or that we don't want or that isn't necessary for us. And similarly, the Buddhist value of renunciation is also a counteraction to greed. Because if we're willing to renounce something that we don't really need, to that extent we are no longer greedy for it. Or at least we're working with that greed in some way. So if we're able to renounce something for a while, that's a start. And maybe we'll decide that we can renounce certain aspects of our economic life forever, that we don't need them, that there are aspects of economic life that we see people advertise for on television or in the newspaper or wherever. We can see that and say, I don't need that. That's not something for me. We renounce it. And in that sense, renunciation can become a practice. And third, that where this leads is to the value of contentment. Being content with what we have, not needing more. Being content with the way our life is, not needing more. Being content with less. Being at least being willing to investigate the possibility of being content with less. Being aware that we can't take it with us, that at some point in our lives we're going to have to give these things away anyway. All this material stuff that we are surrounding ourselves with, at some point is going to be somebody else's, or is going to be destroyed, or is going to be nowhere. So basically we have to understand that that is part of life, is renunciation, is being content with less. And secondly, kindness and compassion, which are, of course, a counteraction, a practice that counteracts our tendency towards anger and hatred. And this can be a problem as we are surrounded by people who disagree with us in various ways about our ideas for policy, about our ethics, and so on. And to come at them, at least as much as we can, and this is of course a difficult practice, but as much as we can with a spirit of openness, of kindness, and of awareness that we're all coming from our own ends and trying to reach our own idea of what's good, that can at least help to defuse some of the stress in our lives and defuse some of the anger in our lives. I would say as well, and a sort of a corollary to that, has to do with guarding the sense doors, which means not getting sucked into the constant samsara, I would say, of the daily news cycle, or even the hourly news cycle, which can spin us out of balance for where we may have been in balance to begin with the day, but then it can often be really toxic to view the news often and often and often. Not to say, as I've given a previous talk, I think, on watching the news in a wise way, the basic idea is, of course, being informed is important. It's critical to our political and our social lives to be informed about what's going on in the world, what's going on in the country. But it's also, I think, important to guard the sense doors, to be aware of the fact that we are not ourselves awakened yet, we're not perfect. There's a maximum amount that we can take before it really just becomes toxic, and it ends up not being helpful. But I'd be interested in your ideas about this, about what you think a Buddhist practice, a secular Buddhist practice, or whatever Buddhist practice, what they can provide us going forward to counteract issues of climate change. Sometimes it helps to have a kind of a plan, of a stepping stone that's been provided by something like a philosophical system, because then we don't have to think it all out for ourselves. We can sort of take steps that have already been laid down before. So, and if you're interested in getting more involved with this, I have a Patreon page I've put up. It's very new. I haven't really discussed it here, but I thought I would mention it for any of you guys who are interested in sort of getting into the more nitty-gritty. I'll have stuff up there from time to time that might be interesting. And thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for your kind comments and questions, and we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Thanks a lot.